Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's session titled A Long Way From Home, featuring Peter Carey and Michael Maher, and hosted by the American Australian Association. I'm Sam Schoen, Global Head of Consultant Relations and Head of North America Institutional Sales for Morgan Stanley. I'm a proud board member of the AAA, an organisation dedicated to strengthening the ties between people and institutions of the United States and Australia. And I'd encourage you to visit the AAA website to learn more about our upcoming events, including our next event, our annual fundraising gala, where we'll be celebrating the 70th anniversary of the ANZUS Treaty with a special in-person event in New York City on the 21st of September. But back to today's conversation, and I'm delighted to open it and welcome two-time Booker Prize winner and Australian icon, Peter Carey. Peter's from a wonderfully named town called Bacchus Marsh, outside of Melbourne, and he's the author of 14 novels that have moved and entertained us. Bliss, Illiwaka, Oscar and Lucinda, The True History of the Kelly Gang, A Long Way From Home. These are just some of the novels that have made Peter one of the world's most celebrated writers. In fact, when American author Toni Morrison was asked which contemporary writers she read, she named just 4, with Peter Carey being one of them. Peter's work has inspired fellow artists to compose operas, write plays, and make films, the most recent being The True History of the Kelly Gang. Since moving to New York 30 years ago, Peter has taught one of the finest creative writing courses in the United States, the MFA in Creative Writing at Hunter College. Peter and his wife, literary editor and agent Frances Cody, are also involved with a program called Still Waters in a Storm, with kids in the poorest neighbourhoods in New York, working with them to improve literacy. Peter's here today in conversation with his good friend and fellow Australian expat, Michael Maher. Michael's a filmmaker, author and producer. A foreign correspondent for 25 years, Michael's reported from across the world. He's served as the ABC's diplomatic correspondent, Indonesia bureau chief, Asia Pacific editor, and New York correspondent, which is where he's lived for the past 15 years. Michael is president of the American Friends of the National Gallery of Australia. During today's conversation, we'll be taking questions for Peter from our audience. So please type in your questions using the live chat function, and we'll have time at the end for Peter to answer them. So with that, I'll hand over to Michael for what should be a truly enjoyable and entertaining discussion. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Sam, for that introduction, and good evening, everyone, or good morning if you're joining us from Australia. Welcome to you, Peter. We're only about 10 blocks away from each other in Lower Manhattan, but good to see you virtually, and thank you so much for taking the time to discuss with us your remarkable journey in the world of letters. The title of your last novel, Peter, was A Long Way From Home. So we thought one of the central themes we might explore today is the concept of home, which of course has been uppermost in people's minds these past 18 months, as so many of us have been prevented from going home due to COVID, and they've had to endure lengthy separations from our families, our friends, and our compatriots. The pandemic has certainly placed the very meaning of home into stark relief, causing us all to ask some vital questions. Where is home? How important is it? What happens when you can't get there? What happens when home is taken away from you? Is it really possible to change homes? Can you have multiple homes? It's surely one of the most fundamental driving forces, I think, in the human condition, and gives rise to all sorts of emotions, reactions, and indeed tensions. In A Long Way From Home, Peter, you explored the idea of home through the prism of race and racism, through white Australian settlers and Indigenous Australians. And as long-term expatriate, it seems home and what it means are never far from our thoughts. So let's take a look at some of these issues with Peter. A number of you have already written in with your questions, and I'm going to try to get to as many of those as possible. You can also send in questions live, as Sam said, as the discussion is underway, so please feel free to do that. They don't all have to be on the subject of home, by the way. I've done a few of these events with Peter, and I can assure you that he's a very generous interlocutor, and I'm sure he'll be happy to field a range of subjects relating to his novels and life as a writer. Isn't that the case, Peter?
Absolutely the case. You mean my answers are too long, but that's all right.
But look, I'm going to start off. Please indulge me with a few questions of my own. Peter, you've lived in New York for 30 years. You're a dual citizen. You've raised a family here. You've written most of your novels here. Where is your home?
Well, it's very complicated, I think. Or it's simple. Clearly, I'm living in New York City. I'm in this apartment, married to Frances, where she is. It's my home. My two boys, Sam and Charlie, live in New York City, where they are. It's my home. But if you looked at it's impossible. If you looked at the books behind me on the shelf, most of them, 8 of them, I think, 8 or 9 have been written here in New York City. And all but 2 of them are really all about Australia. So I'm sitting here in one home, and all I really am interested in, what defines me as a person, I think, is that I'm Australian. And from the minute I arrived in New York City, you started doing this thing. Why are they so weird? And why can't I be understood buying a bagel? And how come Waltzing Matilda seems more and more like science fiction? So, like to explain that the Song of Our Heart is about a homeless person who steals a sheep and commits suicide rather than go into custody, to say that's the song that moves us means we're a lot weirder than they are, maybe. So what's home? But I do always think that, that we have this thing, which when I was in Australia and living in Australia and other people went to other countries to live, I really believed they'd forgotten all about Australia. And that part of their life was over. And it was Carmen Khalil, the Australian publisher who's lived in England for so long, who I thought sounded so English. And I met in Adelaide in about 1986. We're going in a car and we're going through the bush. And she said to me, I just keep dreaming about these trees. And I realized there was sort of an equation, part of the equation that I really hadn't thought about at all. And so I'm like Carmen, and in the sense that I occupy that space of home all the time. Although, as my sister said to me not so long ago, I don't see why you're writing about Bacchus Marsh. You never lived here. In fact, I went away when I was about 11 years old. But I might never live there, but I'm talking to them all the time. So
you mentioned Bacchus Marsh, your hometown, and it was really in Bacchus Marsh that perhaps you had your first connection with America. Your family owned a General Motors car dealership.
I did.
And I remember you telling me that your father would sometimes give you catalogs, lavish catalogs of shining Cadillacs and automobiles. I mean, that would have been enough to set any young boy's heart racing, I guess. And so how did you see America then? Did you ever envisage that one day you may go there to live?
No, never, ever, actually. I mean, I loved those brochures, which were so beautifully produced. Yeah, you get a 1950s, 60s Cadillac brochure, or, cars, maybe not even GM cars that had sort of automatic transmissions where you pressed a button, which seemed like science fiction. So I loved those things, but I never ever imagined I would ever live in America, and I never, the places that I wanted to live. I mean, I lived in London for quite a number, 3 years, I suppose, not long. When I wanted to live in another country, I wanted to live in Kuala Lumpur, in Malaysia, and so it was the chances of life really that sort of washed me up on these shores, because I was married to somebody who desperately wanted to be in the United States. And I thought, well, why not? It can't be uninteresting, but I really didn't think I'd still be here 30 years later.
And oftentimes it was during your generation, when your generation was growing up, or perhaps a little further back than that, Australian writers, artists, musicians, felt compelled to go to London mainly, perhaps the United States, to really just expand their horizons and have opportunity. But you, when you came to New York, you'd already won the Booker Prize.
Yeah.
So, It wasn't.
I had an agent, I had a publisher.
Fame and fortune.
No, I didn't come here for those reasons at all. As I said, I had an agent here, I had publishers, I had people I knew other writers. And I got a job teaching then because that was how I got to get a green card, so I could stay a little longer. No, it was, I'm an older generation and maybe not so different from my grandfather, who had never been to the United Kingdom, but called it home. And I think those were, I would have thought it was silly to be like that, but really I was sort of like that too in my 20s, and it was where one went. And it was where, it wasn't to be acknowledged as an Australian writer in London was certainly not easy. And David Williamson still always says, that if you want to get a laugh in the London theatre, you just have to say Australia, and it will work. And in a way, I used to say, well, when they discovered we could write, it was like we were dogs standing on our hind legs and talking. So the difference, it's not like that now, but it did feel like that then. And America, I didn't even really think about too much, to tell you the truth.
I'm going to go to a couple of questions that people have sent in. Kristen O'Brien in the United States asks, how have you dealt with having your heart in two places at once? Does it inspire your work or create conflict for you? Along the same lines from Michelle Waters in Woodland Hills, also in the United States. Please share how you reconcile a divided heart and conflicted feelings as you straddle dual homes.
Well, it's not really, I mean, there's a part of me, I'm Australia. I lived there for over 40 years, inevitably. Well, I guess in a way, I'm like all the people that are sitting in New York City right now in their therapist's offices talking about their childhood and their past. These things continue to obsess us and to make us, and I'm like that. And at the same time, it isn't actually a conflict for me to feel those things and to ride the 6 train in Manhattan. They can exist at the same time. And as a matter of fact, being on the 6 train or any train, you sit there and you're looking at all these other people who are carrying these other childhoods and these other pasts in them, and you will never know quite what they are. But sometimes I can get dizzy thinking about the complexity of the worlds that are contained within a single subway car, and so that's not a conflict. It's a conflict only at the times when I decide, as I could easily decide about Australia at any moment. Well, this is all rotten. The leadership doesn't work for me. I don't like country A or country B or country C, and I would feel that if I was living in the UK, the United States, or Australia. It's sort of, I guess, writers particularly are like this, but I think citizens are like this too. We're often unhappy with where we are for various reasons, but changing our addresses is not likely to change those situations.
As you mentioned New York, one question here from Lucinda Glover. She says, how has your identity as an Australian been influenced by your experiences as a New Yorker?
Well, I think that I've never not wanted to be Australian. And I have known people who've been here a couple of weeks and their accents changed and they clearly want to be someone else.
I think Barry Humphries called that doing the dog, didn't he? Usually with regard to British accents.
Yeah. I didn't know that expression, but he's a genius, so that's clever. So I think all it's made me do is be more aware that I am Australian and that I'm not like that person. I'm not like that person. The reason I think if I'd been living in Australia, I probably would not have written True History of the Kelly Gang. And it was going to the Met in New York, where a friend of mine, an American friend, was a docent, taking people around the show and talking about it. And I went up there to see the paintings, nervous that somehow the paintings I'd loved in Australia might look provincial in this new environment. And they were absolutely not. They were original, brilliant works of art. And I just started to bring my downtown friends up to the Met. And I walked around with 3 or 4 different people talking about the Kellys and being probably totally boring. But what happened as a result of this, with me thinking that I'd like to write about this, because there's so many things about that story that we think we know that we actually don't. It's the most under-recorded, under-reported, important bit of history in our nation. And I also knew that he'd written the Jerilderie letter, which I'd remembered all my life, and so I could think how I might do it. So that comes from, it's a long way, it's a long answer to a short question, but that's from being an Australian in New York and sort of thinking about the uniqueness of our history and our experience.
I mean, I love that story, Peter, of you being inspired to write true history after visiting the Sydney Nolan exhibition of his Kelly series at the Met, which was, of course, on loan from the National Gallery of Australia. And a little plug here for the American Friends of the National Gallery. We'll arrange that. So it's a great story, and of course, True History of the Kelly Gang is perhaps your best known novel here in the United States, and I understand, much to your bemusement, was publicized as a Western, a sort of Jesse James tale.
Yeah, and well, I did explain to my publisher that Jesse James, I thought Jesse James was a psychopath, not at all like Ned Kelly, but anyway.
Maybe speak a little bit more about what do you think struck a chord here with American readers with True History?
Oh, I guess I'm arrogant enough to think it wasn't simply that it was an outlaw story, that it was among the most extraordinary pages of prose they'd ever read in their life.
And it's interesting because you told me once that one of your Australian friends asked you why on earth you were writing about Kelly.
Yeah, well, they said a couple of things happened. They said, well, I was really excited. I said, I'm writing about Ned Kelly. So why would you bother, Pete? We know all about him. Well, no, we don't, and still don't. And so it's a way of imagining what we can't really know. And the weird thing that happened when the book was published in Australia, the first lot of people who reviewed it, the first 2 or 3 in big papers, reviewed the history of Ned Kelly as they understood it, not from the book. And it took the younger critics, I think, to begin to realize that there might be such a thing as how a book is written and the voice of the book and so on that might matter in the world of literature and Australian literature. It was a short period. I was typically agitated and got over that.
Well, it certainly got a glowing review in the New York Times, and you know, at that time, you were getting glowing reviews in the New York Times, other newspapers in the United States. But you know, Robert Hughes was getting great reviews. Shirley Hazzard was still writing. So really, a very significant Australian artist present in New York at that time, and in the height of their creative powers, really.
Yeah, at the time I remember thinking, and it was a week, you know, where like 3 different Australian writers got the front page of the New York Times, and yet there was nothing to put it together that something might be happening, something might be coming from Australia. And it was like each of us had landed from the moon in a way, and we were not connected to each other. And at that time, I became a little obsessed with it and had the notion that we should get a group of American writers to come to Australia, and we'd go on a train and do readings at stops along the way. And I had some really, really wonderful writers who said they'd do it, including Toni Morrison, by the way. And anyway, no one.
You couldn't give up on the idea that is something that should be done.
Yeah, well, I'd lost my energy for that particular project, but yes, because I think that the thing about that is that, you know, people who visit, my American friends who visited Australia always seem to have a really good time and to enjoy it and to come back sort of with a continuing interest in the country. So and I knew that if American writers came and did that particular trip, it would be a memorable experience. They would form bonds with Australian writers, and it would continue. It would change the climate within which Australian literature was read in the United States and New York in particular. But it was a nice idea, Pete.
Well, just on that point, Peter, I mean, how do you think Australian literature is regarded here in the United States? I mean, you, of course, are a very well-known writer here in the United States, but generally, how does Australian literature fit into the literary landscape here?
I have no idea.
No idea.
No.
You said previously that if you're Australian and you exist in the US, you're not really seen to be a part of it. There is a way, you said, in which one is always an outsider. But a few years back, you were inducted into one of the United States' most elite cultural institutions, the American Academy of Arts and Letters. There's only 250 living American artists members at any given time. Did that make you feel less like an outsider?
Well, there's all sorts of different sort of outsiders, and in different ways. So because when I'm in that gathering, I mightn't know the musicians and the architects at all or very well, but I certainly know the writers, and so I'm being acknowledged by people I generally know some way or another. But that's not really, and so that's nice. And they're my peers, and they're people I respect, admire. But that's not the same as what America, a broader definition of America, I think, thinks about Australian literature.
So we're getting some live questions coming in, and people are picking up on your suggestion of the train ride, Peter. We've got Mandy-Ann Berg has said, please consider bringing Australian writers to ride the trains in the Rockies and to have reading stops in the US. That sounds like a good idea. Another question from Gay Duran is, do you ever feel that you're losing touch with Australia, which may affect your lens if your writing has an Australian setting?
Yeah. I think that's, I mean, when I arrived here in 1990, it was a continual source of anxiety. And it's turned out that I've been able to write about Australia in a way that's generally made sense to Australians. But there's certain aspects of Australian life, of course, I'm not even thinking about it. A country or a culture, it's really like a river, and it sort of changes its banks all of the time. And expatriates can make the awful mistake of thinking that the river is still where it was when they left 20 or 30 years ago, in which case, you're going to fall in the water and drown. That's sort of, I'm aware of that. There's a lot of, I've got sort of 45, I think, years of experience in Australia. It gives me plenty of things to think about. It's an issue. It did make me, I was anxious about it, concerned about it, but as it's turned out, it's been all right.
And I know that you're assiduous in the research you do. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that. I mean, I know for a fact that in a long way from home, I mean, you consulted widely with Indigenous leaders. You're writing a book at the moment, and I know there's a great deal of detailed research that is going into that, because I mean, you're on the phone quite often, aren't you, to Australia, speaking to people to get these.
Yeah,
details.
the phone's amazing. It's amazingly, it's nice to be, sometimes I'm sitting here at 3 a.m. talking to someone, like in the case of A Long Way From Home, someone who taught school in a caravan in Northwest Australia. And I'm talking to these now retired teachers, and I talk to all sorts of people on the telephone, and it's lovely. I'm always really keen to insist that what fiction is to make things up, and that's a joy of reading and writing fiction to enter an imaginary world. But at the same time, I really am sort of fanatical about wanting it. If I'm writing the Kelly Gang, I want that to read for people who know horses, for instance, really well. I want them to read it. They mightn't be literary people, but I want them to read it and tell me what's wrong. Because to tell you the truth, I'm terrified of horses. And yet, to write that book, you've got to be able to convince the people who know horses very, very, very well that I know what I'm talking about, and or flying an aircraft or whatever it is. So I love to give my nearly finished book to people who know more about it than I do. I mean, I had a lovely time in Penang, in Malaysia, where I hadn't been there for many years, and I made a lot of stuff up. So I arrived in Malaysia. Every time I knew I was sort of making something up, I was lying about something, I highlighted it. And I spent my time there with people from Penang dealing with those issues, and it was such fun. It's one of the nicest times as a writer I've had in my life as being in Malaysia. And at the end gave a manuscript to a couple of KL writers who critiqued me. And none of those things ever diminish what you're doing. They make you more, because you've been given gifts by your readers. I say, no. I mean, when you're talking to the elderly Chinese man in Penang, and you say to him, well, I'm writing this, it's wartime, and it's a brothel, and there's a piano. I said, no, culturally impossible. Couldn't have a piano in a brothel. So I say, well, did you have a cabaret? Oh, yes, we had a cabaret. So in the end, that line of investigation led to the most fantastic stuff that, as they say, you couldn't make up. And it's just fun.
Well, here's a question from Giselle Collins from Tamarama, otherwise known as Glamorama, I think, in Sydney. It's a wonderful beachside neighborhood. She asks, how do we ensure truth and facts prevail and are valued in both the media and in fiction?
Good luck.
Yeah.
Yep. I don't know. I think that it's a complicated conversation, the thing between truth and facts. And if we're talking about public conversation, if we're talking about journalism and politics, I don't know. I think we're in a very, very sad situation where we have our society's source of information generally been poisoned one way or another. If I come to fiction, I'm going to want to think about what the truth is, but I'm also at the same time going to insist that I can make things up.
Yes, I mean, you had the luxury as a novelist, as a writer of fiction, to make things up, to do what you want to do. But as you've been underlining, I mean, there has to be truth in it as well. And I know in particular with regard to A Long Way From Home and Indigenous issues, I mean, that was particularly important to you. Perhaps you can talk a little bit about the Indigenous concept of home that you explored in A Long Way From Home.
No, it's not my core.
No, the Indigenous, you explored the issues of home through the prism of race and racism in A Long Way From Home.
Yeah, but you see, firstly, I'm in no position to talk about Indigenous notions of home, and it would be ridiculous, it would be grotesque for me to do that. But if you're looking at the book itself, then there's all sorts of things which are to do with character and situation. About one of the protagonists who imagines he's German and his notions of what that home is, and he's blonde-haired, and I'm sure you all read the books. I'm destroying nothing for you. And at the end discovers actually, he's of Indigenous descent. So in this sort of thing, one's thinking about all sorts of ideas about home and what it means to that character in that situation and to those people around him. But it doesn't put me in a position of being able to.
Oh, and indeed, and I'm not suggesting that, but there was a question along those lines wanting you to perhaps give your views on ideas of home so far as Indigenous people are concerned. And perhaps a better way of getting into that is to talk about this issue, which is front and center at the moment, of appropriation. And you as a white male writer and how you approach these very sensitive subjects?
Well, I think, first of all, I don't blame anybody, I mean, Indigenous person or from any minority, of being very annoyed about the way their particular histories might have been represented and imagined by white people. And the thing I spent a lot of time talking about when I was in Australia for a long way from home was me being in Canberra for a playwrights conference in the 80s sometimes, and Gary Foley standing up and talking to this audience of playwrights, and he's saying, yeah, I know you'll want to help. You'll want to imagine this, because I just ask you one thing, don't do it. Because we've already got so much crap to deal with, the things you've already incorrectly imagined. We don't really need any more. And I felt nothing but sympathy for that statement. And yet, so I got to a stage in my life where I think, well, I'm an Australian writer and I go around the world and he's an Australian writer. Well, what have I ever written about the sort of the basic fact of our country, which, there was an invasion, the land is stolen, and it's true. How do you acknowledge that? How do you even be yourself in that situation? And so I thought, if I die not having written about this, I think it would be really, really shameful. So how can I do that in a way that's authentic? And the first thing in that, and realizing that actually what you're writing about is white Australia and the history of white Australia, because if it wasn't for us people, there wouldn't be the racial problem, if you can call it a problem, the racial conflict that there is in Australia if there'd been no white people. So, and I wanted to write from a position of characters who are ignorant of those things, like my family, which I grew up with and who I loved and love. And then I thought, what I've got to do is just really listen to people a lot. And I spent lots of time talking to people, white people, anthropologists, Indigenous people, teachers, I don't know, all sorts of people. And in the end, when I'd finished it, there was a manuscript. I had my book read by people who were likely to be critical of it, Indigenous writers particularly. And I sort of did okay, I guess. I'm sure there are people out there who don't want to read my book because it would seem impossible that I've done something that's not offensive, or people that read it and think it's crap anyway. But I think the thing of showing care and respect for the people you wish to write about is taking the time, the patience, and just being prepared to listen is something that when Indigenous people think about how they've been written about, I don't think that's really normally been part of their experience, or often. The thing that they worry about, that's not been part of their experience.
Do you think it might even be of help writing about Australia from afar? Does it give you a different perspective?
I think it probably does. It was, mind you, it was when I was leaving in 1990, it was the excuse my friends gave me. They said, well, it'll be good, Pete. Yeah, you'll be able to look at us from, greater distance. But I thought that was too easy. I wasn't going to tell you. I thought, no. Got nothing to do with that. But in fact, I think the distance has probably been helpful. But how can I know? It's the road not taken. So.
A lot of people have written in, Peter, asking how often you go back to Australia.
Well, probably it depends. Probably every year, every 2 years, every 3 years. It just depends on opportunity. I haven't been back for 3 years now.
A lot of people, COVID has gotten in the way.
Well, it has.
No.
But the weird thing, and that you don't even need to Zoom. I mean, telephone's actually a remarkably intimate sort of instrument as far as sort of keeping in touch with people and talking to people. So I'm well aware that there are sort of bigger parts of the society that I'm not sensitized to. But as far as my brother, well, he just died. But my sister and my friends in Australia, it's I don't feel separated from them. But as for what's happening in the society itself.
There's a question here from Adam Sadiq that's come in live. Do you fear the pervasiveness of American culture will endanger or change the authentic Australian voice?
I worry about global capitalism, but maybe this is not the time and place to be talking about that.
American culture, I assume that Adam is meaning American film, music, novelist.
I don't know. I mean,
Have a huge impact in Australia. I mean,
yeah, those things matter a lot, and but it seems to me Australia does keep a different character, no matter what. But let's just remember we're in a position now where we're experiencing, because of global business practice, dreadful climate change, global warming, fires, floods, hurricanes. And if you think about what I worry most about sort of, let's say, cultures that are alien to the working class culture of Australians in the beginning of the 20th century, then that's it. It's, look at our country. Look at the devastation that climate change. Look at the barrier reef. Look at the fires, and why aren't we doing something about that? Well, so maybe, I worked in business in Australia, and
well, clearly you're still very engaged in all of the issues that are important back in Australia. You're also very engaged outside of your writing in New York's very vibrant literary community. You've been head of the much heralded master's program in creative writing at Hunter College for some time, and I had the pleasure of sitting in on one of your classes and just seeing how you interact with your students. Clearly you did something that you enjoy immensely, as your students who are lucky enough to have you as their professor. You've also, as Sam mentioned in the introduction, been involved with a wonderful not-for-profit called Still Waters in a Storm, which helps improve literacy in some of New York's poorest neighborhoods. How important is this sort of community work to you?
Well, I have to be honest and say I haven't done a lot for Still Waters in the Storm over the last 2 or 3 years. So if it was vitally important, that wouldn't be true. Although it's something that I really enjoyed being part of, and I actually admired the person who ran it so much. A guy called Stephen Haff, who was a Yale graduate, but decided what he was going to do is go to the poor area, go to Bushwick, where the kids are often from parents are illegal immigrants. They're having a bad time at school, and he takes them from being the worst readers in their class to the best readers in their class, and that's something that moves me and just reminded me I should get back there a little bit more. Hunter College is a fabulous place to teach, in the sense that it's a place where the kids who are the first people in their family to get a university degree go. And as we've become more and more selective and better known, we're getting the voices that come from those experiences. I mean, I was in our first class this semester last night, and those young people come from everywhere, and they want to be there, and they're hungry for it. They appreciate where they are, and I appreciate being with them. One of the things you think you're going to come from Sydney to here, who are you ever going to know that's really part of the complexity of New York life? Are you going to end up just knowing writers and editors? And that's been my great good fortune. That it hasn't been like that at all. And also to learn to realize how Australians can instinctively and from their own experience connect with and understand say, a student from Nigeria or from, or we're sort of good at understanding colonialism, or we should be if we're not. And and also our sort of relationship with the metropolitan centres, our sense of being on the periphery, all these things are sort of things that are useful to all sorts of people from other places. Anyway, I love doing that, and they're great.
And I believe for the first time you actually have a student who's an Indigenous Australian writer.
He just graduated, yeah.
Oh,
yes.
Fantastic.
No, that was really thrilling, and I was really very pleased that he came here, because he was I won't say his name, but he was in the sense of being overpraised at home. He wasn't ready to be overpraised. He really needed something a bit tougher before he went back to deal with being home again. He's a wonderful person, incredibly intelligent and well-read and talented too. So that was a good thing to do.
Interesting as well, Peter. I mean, how important is it for young Australian Indigenous writers to be able to leave Australia and the weight that I'm sure Indigenous creative people have in their homeland, to leave and not being seen first and foremost as an Indigenous person, but first and foremost as a writer?
Well, I have no right to speak to that directly, but what I just said about this particular student, I think probably addresses it, and that there were two things, as you say, a great weight of responsibility, which is pretty heavy as part of a community, and then the thing of white people mostly overpraising and people, and that's not helpful in the tough business of becoming good. So I was very, he and his wife came here, and they're both gutsy, good people, and they're pleased they came. So,
and aren't we living in a remarkable time so far as today's literature is concerned? Just the sheer diversity of it, is unprecedented, really. The new voices that yes. We're hearing. Your brilliant wife, a literary agent, before that a publisher, Frances Cody. I mean, I know that she's at the forefront of bringing some of these exciting new writers to the forefront. Perhaps you can talk about that.
Well, that's just her curious talent from the beginning. She's English, but she's always represented and been interested in people away from the mainstream. And she edited and published Edward Said, for instance, and in this country, her clients are people I don't know how well they're known in Australia, but Ocean Vuong, an amazing Vietnamese American writer, and Claudia Rankine, an African American poet and essayist, and enormous variety of. So that my life at home is very much informed by these interactions that she has daily with these very, very interesting people. I think we're at a time where people who buy books really want to know what it is to be other than they are. And it's a really healthy social thirst and appetite. And so the clients that Frances is representing now seem to be people that people really, really want to hear from, and that's thrilling.
I'd like to ask you a question on, many of your books, well, quite a few of your books anyway, have been made into films. Bliss was made into an opera. Your books have been made into plays. What's your relationship with filmmakers, playwrights who come along and want to take your work and make it into something else?
Well, firstly, that's obviously their right. Secondly, it'd be really foolish if you thought they weren't going to do that. When somebody wants to make a film of your book, then it's not going to be a book anyway. Books are made with little symbols on paper or on the screen. Films are made from electricity and light. They're dramatic, they're different. See, it's never going to be the same. I remember when Gillian Armstrong was making Oscar and Lucinda, and I think she just made it, I can't remember, she and I did some events together in New York. And people would ask me this sort of question about what I felt about what Julian was going to do, and I'd say, well, when I wrote the book, I gave myself the right to fail. And I give the same right to Julian. And Julian would say, or succeed, or succeed.
Okay.
But anybody doing anything that's worthwhile as an artist is from the very beginning, if it's worthwhile, going to face the risk of failure. And that's the electricity that runs through my life, that I'm doing something that I don't know how to do, and I'm scared and I'm excited and stimulated. And so if somebody wants to make a movie based on my book, well, I like the check. Sometimes it gets smaller as the thing progresses, but if leaving that to one side.
Is there a particular film that based on one of your novels that you did like, that you thought was successful?
I'm not going to get into that because I've worked with a number of people, and why be offensive to people who've done things because they love your work? So no.
Right. Okay. We'll leave that there. Look, there's another question that has come in from Trevor Rowe in Sydney. This is a question, more general question about the United States, I guess politics here, and your sense of that. Is the social fabric in the USA so polarized, Trevor asked, that it is in danger?
Oh, it does feel like it's in danger. But I'm just a novelist. I'm in charge of the whole world within a few pages, and I can. How about that? As for the real world, yes, it does feel polarized. Everybody seems isolated from everybody else. There seems to be very poor sense of community. The chains of information are so appalling that people would rather have a deworming thing for cattle than approve vaccination. So you'd have to say that a society that's got itself into that sort of state is in serious trouble. Yes, it's in serious trouble. I'll tell you what to do about it.
Yes.
Some other time.
Look, you've likened your life in New York to that famous Saul Steinberg cartoon depicting Manhattan as a thriving, self-contained microcosm looking out onto a bleak hinterland across the Hudson. Do you ever venture out, Peter, into the rest of the United States?
Well, I have. I haven't been doing it lately.
Yeah.
And probably I think the only thing when you go on book tour, you travel all the time and you meet people, and you have time off, and you have opinions about places, and you're pleased you went to Memphis and you went to some great blues clubs and had all that sort of stuff. I live with a very good friend of mine who's dead now, an American and Australian painter called James Doolan, who lived in the Mojave Desert, and I spent some very interesting time there in the land of the paranoid and armed in the Mojave Desert. So I did that, but for mostly, I live in New York, and New York's an enjoyable place to live. Living in the Mojave Desert, not so much, perhaps.
New York. So yes, I mean, living in New York. Let's talk about that a little bit. We're coming up to the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, and you wrote a very poignant piece after that attack and your experiences on that day. You also wrote about how it changed the way you felt about your city, and also more widely about living in this country. Perhaps you can expand on that a bit, Peter.
Well, I think I wrote it in a sort of relatively emotional state. I'm not sure that I'd stand by all of that quite now, and in fact, I really think I shouldn't have written it.
Why is that?
Well, when I say to my former editor in London, I don't want to do this, and he says, "I'll give you more gold than your apron can hold," and you're in a situation in your life where you might need that, and then later he pays you $1 a word. So it's complicated. So
you and I have discussed this. There are certain events that happen in the city, 9/11 being one of them, you know, maybe Hurricane Sandy, various other things where you can feel it in the sinews of the city that day, the city pulling together.
yeah, it was, well, there were so many different things I felt about that day. You know, a sort of a rage. Everything was very raw and emotional. The people you knew not terribly well, who you ran into in the street, would embrace you. The smell of burning plastic and burning people was unforgettable. The sight of all these trucks coming down that first night, I can't remember where they were coming down 6th Avenue, but I don't know whether it was the first night or the second night to come down and sort of clear the site. It was incredibly moving. And just to stand on the street and just watch truck after truck after truck of, you know, individual people who were truck drivers and whatever. I've sometimes, and now to this day, been made very uneasy by the meaning of the American flag in political situations. And I know numbers of my friends who didn't like the way the American flag was used in 9/11 and how people were using the flags. At that particular time, I didn't think that at all. I thought there were people who were really hurt and frightened and were making a sign of, you know, being collectively together. You know, I never went, I lived very, as you know, we live very close to that site now, minutes away. At the time, I didn't visit, and I didn't want to visit, and I think I blocked an awful lot of things that I felt at that time. And every now and then I see some footage or see something that recalls exactly what it was like. It was just awful. It was just beyond belief. And it wasn't like all those images all over the rest of the world of the towers falling and the flames. It was something else. It was so.
Years ago, next month. How does being, Mrs. Marianne Berg has just written in, how does being an Australian in New York help with acuity when it comes to biases/views that Americans have of other Americans from other places and internal cultures?
I don't think it necessarily helps. Maybe if you're going to agree with me and say that the opinions are often insane, then maybe the insanity is more painfully felt and one is more exasperated by its insanity. But that would be to suggest that somehow we Australians are in some sense sort of morally superior, which I certainly don't believe. Well, we all see and feel those things. And
Another question is coming from Lisa Sharkey. Do you have a favorite book of your own or from some other author?
Yes. Well, I actually, here we are. Here's an opportunity for me to push a book. Very good.
Feel free.
Well, you know, one of the books that I've written really one book that really concerns the United States, and it's called Parrot and Olivier in America. And what made me start thinking about it was thinking about Tocqueville's Democracy in America, where all my American friends sort of suggested, yeah, that there was this French aristocrat who came here and sort of really appreciated American democracy, and was a friend of America and celebrated it. And I started to think about this, and I thought, this can't be right, really. It's got to be a lot more complicated than that. And so, you know, I read Tocqueville's Democracy in America, and clearly there's lots of things he feared. And you can say he feared them because he was an aristocrat, or he feared them because he was his parents were survivors of the revolution, or he feared them. But so I decided I would investigate would do something that related to that book, and a French aristocrat. And in real life, Tocqueville came with his posh friend and to examine America and the prisons and so forth, really to get away from France at that particular difficult time. I had his servant, he came with an English printer as his servant. And I keep on thinking about the book, because if you get to the end of the book, you find that what's there is Donald Trump. And I'm sort of proud of that. And it was written during the last years of the Bush-Cheney administration. And so Parrot and Olivier in America is something I'm really particularly proud of. And I just know people in other countries have noticed this, but in the United States, since publication, it's rarely been observed. That particular, I mean, it sells.
and other writers, perhaps you're often compared to Charles Dickens, William Faulkner. Are they authors that, of course, we all read them? I mean, that you're particularly drawn to?
Well, you know, who you're compared to really has got a lot to do with what's fed into the food chain from publicists over the years, and the weird thing about Charles Dickens, which people started to say, I think, when I published Illywacker, and it came out of London a lot. At that stage, I'd never read Charles Dickens. I couldn't stand Charles Dickens. And then later, I think it was a nauseatingly good little girl in Bleak House, where put me off Dickens, which was silly of me. And then later, I did read Dickens, and I was much to learn from Dickens and appreciated Dickens. But it started to be said before I'd read Dickens. So Faulkner, because I told the publicist, probably. I don't know.
So I know I'm not supposed to ask. One isn't supposed to ask an author what they're writing at the moment and working on. I will anyway, because you are working on another novel. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
No, I've said too much already.
You've given too much away. I don't think you have. Where is it set?
It's all right.
I'll try again. In Australia, is it set in Australia?
Yeah, it's set in Australia. It's set in, if I can make it work. You know, I mean, that's the thing one always feels. Well, it's set in the territory around Bacchus Marsh, Geelong, the Bellarine Peninsula. It's an area which I was delighted to discover had another identity as the new volcanic provinces. And it's a way of thinking about landscape and place. I mean, there probably won't be an earthquake or an explosion or anything like that in the book, but I like to start by thinking about territory physically, and to think about deep geological history is an interesting way for me to think about.
Well, Peter, I'm sure I can speak on behalf of everyone, so we're very much looking forward to that book appearing and being able to read it. I'm afraid we've run out of time. That's all we have time for. Thank you very much for answering so many of our audience's questions. As always, it's been a pleasure to sit down with you, albeit virtually, to moderate this discussion. Thank you as well to the AAA for staging the event, and to all of you who have joined us live to ask your questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them, but we got through quite a few. Enjoy the rest of the evening or your morning, as the case may be, and stay well. Thank you. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.